Okay, so thank you again for this kind introduction. The piece that we will be discussing today is a piece that Dafna, Dror-Shpoliansky and myself co-wrote. This is a piece that was published recently at the European Journal of International Law. It's an international law piece. And it is what we sometimes refer to as an agenda setting piece. It doesn't really have all the answers. It actually has relatively few answers, but it raises, we hope, a lot of questions and tries to introduce a certain typology to address some of these questions and maybe to have a better understanding of the direction in which the field is going to. At the heart of this project, which Dafna is working on for a PhD, and I'm working on from a number of angles, is the quite banal insight that there is a significant gap between the growing interest in digital human rights, which you can see in the slide, some relatively recent high-profile instances in which digital human rights questions were captured public attention, and yet there is very limited academic treatment in terms of attempts to conceptualize the problems of fit that this specific subfield of human rights law generates vis-a-vis the broader constellation of human rights law norms, institutions, and theories. And what we are proposing in this article is that whereas traditional human rights law continues to apply in online spaces and vis-a-vis digital technology issues pertaining to digital technology, there is growing acceptance of the view that certain adjustments need to be made with respect to these existing rights, that some new rights have to be developed, and perhaps more significantly that we have a more perhaps fundamental problem than we have initially evaluated vis-a-vis the suitability of the international human rights law framework and the political setting that undergirds it for digital space in terms of needs, interests of actors, but also in terms of governance power of different actors dominant in this field. The point of departure for this specific article is what we have been seeing in practice, in the practice of human rights law. Human rights law is often articulated and reiterated in public fora, such as the Human Rights Council, which is a political body in which states come together and adopt resolutions that perhaps give expression to the way they understand the law as it currently stands. And what we have been seeing both in the Human Rights Council and also at the General Assembly, which encompass even a larger number of states coming together and adopting resolutions, is on the one hand increased interest, as I said before, in digital human rights law. So there is an increased treatment of issues pertaining to digital human rights law. There is also increased interest in establishing, for instance, expert bodies or expert mandate holders that would further investigate the practical application of human rights in digital spheres. But on the other hand, we are seeing that the point of departure, the intellectual, practical, normative point of departure for the application of human rights in the digital sphere is what we call normative, throughout the paper, normative equivalence. That is that there is a strong belief that human rights apply in the online sphere, by and large in similar ways to which they apply in the offline sphere. And this is indeed the main normative proposition that the first and second part of the article are concerned with. For the sake of context, this is not a completely new discussion. we have seen very, very early on, when the internet became a very public commodity, and access to the internet became a household matter, questions had arisen at the time in legal and, of course, political circles as to whether one should understand the application of law to the internet as something which is an extension of existing laws, and hence parts of the internet would fall, parts of the internet infrastructure would fall under the sovereignty of this country, and other parts would fall under the sovereignty of that country. And certain companies would fall under the jurisdiction of this state, and certain individuals under the jurisdiction of that state. And then you have to basically deal with it as what we lawyers sometimes call a private international law issue, or conflict of laws, or maybe you need some international regulation, and certainly domestic legislation could be relevant, or whether this is something like Monty Python says, something completely different. Which is a space over which states should have limited power, limited influence, and therefore it should be conceptualized as a deterritorialized space, which is not really part and parcel of state sovereignty, more akin maybe to outer space than to physical space on this planet. And it is fair to say that this debate has, in practice, been decided mostly in the favor of the first approach, the more state-centered approach. So we do consider at this point in time the cyberspace, the internet, digital technology as something which is the object of state regulation, the object of international regulation, and hence comes the normative equivalence framework as an application of this way of thinking to the topic of to the subject of human rights law. Now, we do not contest. It's important to state we do not contest the idea that offline human rights are relevant to what's happening in cyberspace, and we do accept that maybe as a temporary baseline or a normative floor, it makes sense before you develop new rights or before you generate consensus surrounding radical reinterpretations of existing rights. It makes sense not to let go of what you already have. But in terms of going forward, we are quite skeptical, Dafna and myself, and Dafna will explain further on why, as to whether this normative equivalence approach can serve as the principal framework of applying human rights to digital spaces or to digital technology. And our greatest concern is about the mismatch between the political structures of human rights law as they were developed in the physical world and the political structures of human rights law as they are interpreted and applied in digital spaces. So very briefly, human rights law have been developed around the notion of the state. So human rights law, you could say, is a philosophical, a legal, a political science, and of course practical response to the emergence of a state in the 17th century as the locus of governance powers and having a monopoly of force. And human rights were there to basically curb excesses, to limit abuses, to protect individuals from government, and later on also to harness the power of regulation that governments have vis-a-vis social services and the like, so as to cater the needs of the individual. The space that we are dealing with, an online space, but this also applies to some extent to digital technology more broadly, has features which are very different from the classic mold of the state system. We are talking about the space which is deterritorialized, It is decentralized, it is mostly privatized, and it is also to a large extent globalized. And thinking about these issues that really have limited bearings to territory, limited bearing to central government power, limited bearing to a specific the responsibilities of specific states in specific places, basically to address the field from these very specific perspectives, really risks engaging in tunnel visions that would make you lose the broader picture. So this is essentially our concern with this approach. That doesn't mean that the resolutions don't have some valuable insights for us to take away. So the resolutions, I think, are an interesting starting point in the sense that they identify certain problems with the development of international human rights law in digital space. For instance, the problem of the digital divide, or the problem of digital literacy, or problems also within developed countries of unequal access to online services and its socioeconomic ramifications. The problem of remedies, how do you actually enforce these laws when sometimes individuals are not even aware that violations have occurred? So there are many practical issues that are raised. At the broader level, I think that these resolutions also help us. At least they provide one possible approach to understanding the role of human rights in digital spaces. They basically take the view that the internet, which is a central preoccupation of these resolutions, is a medium through which individuals enjoy human rights. For instance, they express themselves, they engage in political participation, and therefore states have a role from this point of view in facilitating access to the internet, so that as many individuals as possible can enjoy their rights over this space. So, for instance, the resolutions underscore that the internet should be global, should be open, should be interoperable. It's also being access to the internet should be promoted because the internet is an important tool for personal development. They also take the position that in order to have meaningful access to the internet has to be a relatively safe space. So, for instance, cybersecurity is an issue. Privacy infringements is an issue. Hate speech is an issue, because all of these issues do raise concerns about safe access to the internet. And finally, they also think about internet governance. I mean, they realize that this is a governance space, and that governance should be human rights friendly. But they also, it's hard for them actually to capture the role that private companies have in this space, the GAFAMs of the world, or private regulators such as ICANN. They have no way to reach them because the human rights bodies typically deal with states, so they basically try indirectly to approach governance issues through encouraging states to basically facilitate, initiate, engage in multi-stakeholder governance of the internet, and also try to push businesses to embrace some corporate responsibility principles. So this is the approach, which has many virtues, but I think it also underscores the limits of that approach, because ultimately we are trying to deal with a very complex problem through the tools we used in the past to deal with a very different complex problem. So it's really about how easily you can actually transplant your strategy that you have honed in one area to a radically different area. And here we have our doubts. Moreover, and these are some of the doubts that I've alluded to, these systemic challenges. In the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward. But I think that the article then goes to basically observe that regardless of what the states, the governments who are negotiating these resolutions and adopting them with great fanfare and in Geneva, what have you, or New York, whatever they had in mind, in actuality, we are seeing already a certain pushback. So we are seeing states adopting new human rights in their constitutions for the digital age. We are seeing some international bodies, for instance, the European Union, but also some other international bodies, speaking about new human rights, a need for a new bill of human rights. We are seeing private associations actually come together and publish a digital bill of rights or digital charters. So I think there is a growing acceptance or a growing acknowledgement of the fact that proceeding on the old trodden road of international human rights law may not be sufficient to address the needs. Hence, you need to actually develop a new strategy. And here, what we are actually proposing in this article, and this is in a way, I think the main innovation of this article, is that we are trying to basically identify a typology for 3 moves that we are seeing as taking place within the human rights movement. I will go briefly over the 3, and then Dafna will drill down into the second move, which is probably the most dramatic, the development of new human rights. And we think that actually identifying these 3 moves helps us develop a better understanding of the promise and limits of international human rights law as it currently exists, and maybe also predict certain future developments in this field. So we are using here something which is within international human rights law, a very well-known metaphor, which is the 3 generations metaphor. Within human rights law, a notable international lawyer by the name of Karel Vasek has developed in the late 1970s a claim, an historical claim, that posited that human rights law has developed through 3 different pushes or 3 different trajectories, which he called 3 different generations. And that was, I think, a very insightful observation, because it was able to attach different approaches to different points in time and different problems that human rights has faced. So in human rights law, the first generation would be called the civil and political rights, which are designed to protect individuals from oppressive governments. Then you have a century later, so these will be the 17th, 18th century rights. Then in the 19th century, you see within domestic human rights a push towards the social state, and the harnessing of state power in order to provide social services. So these are the economic, social, and cultural rights. And then in the 20th century, you're seeing another push for group rights, or what he calls solidarity rights, which is really to address the collective interests of groups of persons, such as minorities or peoples, etc. And we were thinking that you could actually identify these 3 moves, not separated centuries from one another, but still separated in terms of the degree of their acceptance within the doctrine, but also the degree of deviation that they represent vis-a-vis traditional human rights law. So the first generation is really taking existing rights, but reinterpreting them. So one example we give in the article is freedom of expression, which is, for instance, we are seeing that because of the features of the architecture of online platforms and the very speedy spread of offensive speech, for instance, the First Amendment kind of approach that was probably plausible for offline speech is no longer possible, and there are growing expectations for companies to regulate offensive speech or disinformation, etc., because of the great impact of this speech on society, and actually on speech, on the quality of the market of ideas. Or with regard to privacy, we are seeing a switch from an offline focus on an intimate space, private space that the government cannot intrude, and actually extension through interpretation of notions of privacy to the public sphere. So as, for instance, to address use of facial recognition technology in the public sphere. So in order to do that, we really have to reinterpret and in a way identify new justifications for why we need privacy, or even redefine the concept of privacy in order to adjust existing law to new technology. Then we have some second generation rights, and Dafna will expand on them. But essentially, I would say that these rights I wouldn't say that they are unconnected to existing rights. They are derived from the basic principles that we find also in existing rights: dignity, liberty, autonomy. But they do express some very distinct needs that you're very hard pressed to find within a physical space, such as, for instance, data portability, which is something it's a right that makes sense actually only when you have a kind of technology that is so much dependent on data and on who holds the data and how you can use the data. So it's really intermeshed with the technology itself. So we argue that this is the second generation, and we are starting to see that in certain contexts. It's not as widely accepted as the first generation reinterpretations. But it's growing. And then there would be a third generation of rights, which really take human rights law and revolutionize some key aspects of it. Most importantly, well, firstly, it would expand maybe also to apply to the rights of digital persons. This is something which is just starting. We've had about 2 months ago, the European Union has issued a draft declaration on human rights for the digital age, on digital human rights and principles. And there, for instance, they are talking about a right to digital personality. They're talking about a right to digital legacy. So these are new aspects about relating to personhood, which existing human rights law has not really come to terms with. So we are actually drawing in the article an analogy between the emergence of corporations as right holders and the emergence of virtual persons as right holders. But then perhaps more dramatically is an attempt to apply concepts of obligations deriving from human rights law vis-a-vis not governments, but actually technology companies that exercise what we call quasi-governmental power. So the argument would be that when Facebook is deplatforming the president of the United States, it is actually exercising a governmental-like power. It is drawing up rules, it is adjudicating claims, it is enforcing its principles. So the argument goes that as power shifts from governments to technology companies, there would be a justification for developing these norms. And we are again starting to see here and there some harbingers of this tendency of trying to apply these norms to technology companies, either by incentivizing them to self-regulate, introducing into ethical codes of design these ideas, but also gradually also extending the purview of review by law enforcement bodies vis-a-vis these companies. So I think I'll stop now, Dafna, and hand over to you to maybe go a bit deeper into second generation rights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yuval. And so indeed, as Yuval described, we propose in the paper to move beyond the normative equivalency paradigm. While the normative equivalency paradigm is established on the perception that the same human rights that people have offline would apply online as well, we suggested to take a different approach, to develop modalities, to the new generation of human rights that would complement the existing human rights framework that we have in order to capture those new challenges that Yuval has mentioned, the new challenges that are new in the digital sphere. And so one of them was the development of new digital rights. These are the second generation human rights. And these rights are rights that are designed for the digital arena. And there are two types or categories that we describe in the paper, two types of those kind of digital rights. The first is rights that simply have no equivalent rights in the offline world. So those are the kind of rights that represent needs or values or interests that we cannot find in the offline world. There is no close parallels that we can draw from. And the second group of digital rights are rights that they might have similar equivalent rights, but are not fully subsumed in the human rights from which they originate. And those rights in the offline world does not really capture their significance in the online virtual world. And so the first, I want to exemplify it by two rights. The first one is the emerging right not to be subject to automated decision making. And this really a kind of right that shows that some concerns just did not exist in the offline world. Those are new concerns. And we are witnessing in recent years that significant decisions in various aspects of people's lives are increasingly shifting. They're shifting from the hands of humans to algorithmic machines. And those algorithmic decisions are based on data gathering, on processing, on analysis, which often predicts human behavior. On the basis of these certain classifications and predictive formulas, they produce a decision. And it raises legal concerns and ethical concerns, such as bias as a result and lack of transparency. That the current international legal framework could provide maybe an answer to some of those concerns, but it cannot really provide an answer to the mere dehumanization of the process. I mean is that boxing individuals into algorithmic categories and limiting basically their possibility to make a conscious choice to not belong to a certain specific social group is a concern in and of itself. And those kind of decisions, such as judicial decisions or administrative decisions, usually when they are taken by human beings, they use moral intuition or moral agency that involve kind of an interpersonal interaction, which machines just don't own. And therefore we can maybe justify designated a specific new human right that would preserve some of this human sense or human control over the decisions that are based on this data. And I should say that a notable development in this field is already in the GDPR in Article 22 that provides that data subject has a right not to be subject to a decision which is based solely on automated processing when those decisions kind of produce legal effects that significantly affect the life of the data subject. And moving to the other type of right, which is exemplified by the right to internet access. So those digital rights, they are a derivative from rights that already exist in the offline world, but they're not recognized as a standalone human right because under the normative equivalency paradigm, new technologies are viewed as tools or channels to exercise offline human rights. In other words, the internet is only a facilitator for the already existing human rights. But if we take a closer look and examine the right to access and how it developed in recent years and what it means really, what it means for people's lives today, especially when we think in this time, of a global crisis, COVID-19, we understand that it's much more than a media. It's much more than a way to perform our right to free expression. But it's really it's an access to an arena of social interaction and the key element to perform other human rights. And so there are three main justifications for acknowledging it or to justify it as an independent right. The first is really a normative justification. And a normative justification is more focused on the social process of recognizing the rights. And we see both on the national level and in the international level decisions that support a right to acknowledge a right to access. For example, several countries have already recognized the right to internet access in their legislation, such as Estonia and Spain and Finland. And also in the international level, we see more and more declarations, documents referring to access to internet as a right. And already in 2011, the United Nations Rapporteur for Free Expression, he didn't really present it as a right, but he did emphasize that states have positive obligation to facilitate the right to free expression over the internet. And we see over the years that really global and regional bodies, the Organization for American States, the Council of Europe, the African Commission on Human Rights, have repeatedly emphasized the importance of ensuring access to the internet. It's really an indispensable component for realizing other human rights. The second aspect is more of a moral justification that's focused on the role of internet access today. And as I said before, it's really hard to imagine how we can manifest any of our rights today without access to the internet or new technologies. And because it's so necessary and vital, it's becoming more and more a right to have rights. And because perhaps especially when we think about it as a very, what is becoming a very powerful arena today to shape public opinion. And I think it really connects to what Yuval has mentioned about Trump being banned from Twitter and Facebook. It's not as in the often words, a newspaper didn't take his quote or something. It's more similar to an exile than to just disconnection. And coming back to the COVID-19 example, digital platforms were the only way for people to be in any social interaction, to exercise their right to work, to access health services, etc. So when we think about what it means to shut down internet connection, especially in times of crisis, for example, in times of war, it creates a sense of chaos in society. It might bring to chaos, to uncertainty, a sense of helplessness maybe of the public, and indeed the right to access, it has two components. So the first one is really about the access, the infrastructure, the internet connection, which I mentioned how vital it is today. And this is again another reason to think about it, to underscore why it should be a right, because it's some sees as a way to overcome the digital divide. We need to remember that today, I think a last report from 2021 by the ITU showed that 37% of the world's population have never used the internet. And this aspect is we need the right in order to kind of draw from it and see how can we overcome this problem. The other aspect is access to online content. We are witnessing in recent years that digital platforms are exploited to promote fake news, propaganda, harmful content. And we also see, reports from recent years by the UN Rapporteur for Free Expression really indicated that internet shutdowns mostly happen in those sensitive times, in times of elections, in times of political rivals, of armed attacks. And so, and we see now a very vibrant debate when in the situation in Eastern Europe, there is ongoing discourse between Google and Meta and Twitter and Telegram and the governments, Ukraine, Russia, and also the European Union and the US officials on how those companies need, what's their role and how should they tackle disinformation and fake news that in this kind of time can really risk people's lives. This brings me to the other question, and Yuval has also mentioned it, is to what extent can we demand from those companies to resist restriction on access to the internet? And the fact that these kind of decisions are really still in the hands, of internet access, of what content do we see, it's all in the hands of private entities, raises a question if it's kind of it creates a legal anomaly in that sense because of its meaning. And the third and last justification to recognize it as a standalone human right is more focused on the utilitarian aspect. We need to name a right in order to develop enhanced protection frameworks. And as a practitioner, I must say that beyond the moral value, it's very hard to develop frameworks to protect human rights, develop them to create suitable and effective remedies, and to do this fine tuning that many times we need in those sensitive issues, such as filtering content. It's very hard to do so without having a right to internet access. And it also might help to develop a sense of entitlement for the users themselves to claim those rights. So just to summarize this point, I guess it's the extraordinary social effect of the internet on human conditions, and the fact that it's becoming a right which is vital to human lives, it supports the fact that we see it as it has an added value in and of itself. A right that we can't really find it's the same importance manifested in rights from the offline world, and this is why we need to think about how to conceptualize it as a new digital human right. And Yuval, do you have anything that you would like to add in this point?
I think we are our work here is done, and that we are very happy to hear questions, comments from participants in this seminar.